Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact and donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each Tuesday. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy, it only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. It really is that easy. So thank you so much. Previous guests on the show have included Andrew Root, Justin Bailey, and Christopher Watkin. You could go back, listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is Mark Baker. I'm really excited to have Mark back on the podcast. If you haven't listened to the previous episode I did with him, it is well worth a listen. It would actually inform some of the way that you hear this episode too. So go back, listen to that one as well. Mark Baker is professor of mission and theology at Fresno Pacific Biblical Seminary. He previously was a missionary in Honduras for 10 years and a campus minister with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at Syracuse University for 3 years. He continues ministry involvement in Latin America through regular visits. He has written a number of books in English and Spanish, including Ministering in Honor, Shame Cultures and Centered Set Church. His latest book is Freedom from Religiosity and Judgmentalism, Studies in Paul's Letter to the Galatians. So Mark and I sit down and we have a great conversation around Paul's letter to the Galatians. We talk about non-judgmentalism, bounded, fuzzy, and centered sets as a lens in which to view Galatians, our orientation to God and to each other in the body of Christ, and spiritual powers that have influenced us, and the freedom that we have from them. It's a really good conversation, so enjoy my conversation with Mark Baker. Mark, welcome back to the podcast. I'm excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much, Joshua. It's great to be back on again.
Yeah, I'd love to dive straight in to your new book, Freedom from Religiosity and Judgmentalism, a study in Paul's letter to the Galatians. So we're gonna dive into Galatians, and we're gonna dive into figuring out, where do we get this freedom? How do we get this freedom? So let's start with a setup to Galatians. What is Paul getting at? What's the letter, and what's the lens in which we're trying to view this book?
Maybe a place to start actually is with Luther, because I think that has put us on a path to assuming we know what's going on in Galatians in a way that, if Luther wasn't on the scene, we'd probably think differently. And sometimes Bible scholars dig very, very deep into details for new readings and stuff. And this is a situation, I think, more where I'm inviting readers, hey, just read the letter and, sort of just in an obvious way, what do you think is going on? So I think what has happened is because Luther, through reading Paul, Galatians, and Romans, he was someone, burdened with guilt and confused about salvation, thinking was by works. He receives correction, freedom, salvation through reading Paul. And since the Reformation time, I think many of us have tended to read Galatians as if Paul was writing the letter to people like Luther, who were struggling with guilt, and that the problem that was going on in the church of Galatia was that there were people there, as in Luther's day, who were teaching salvation as by works. And so what I say is, well, let's read the letter of Galatians itself and see from the letter what are clues as to what was going on, why Paul is writing the letter. And I think a really big clue is a story that Paul recounts in chapter 2, where he tells about this situation, this time when in Antioch, he tells this story of the people, the Christians in Antioch are all eating together, one table, Jews and Gentiles, table fellowship, followers of Jesus eating together. And this is a radical thing. This is something the Jews didn't do. And now, but because of Jesus, they're doing it together. Peter comes to visit. He joins in the table fellowship. doesn't surprise us. Peter's the way that, through Cornelius opened the way. But then these visitors come from Jerusalem who are also Jesus followers, what we would call Christians. And, but these are Jewish men lived their whole life not interacting with Gentiles in this way, and they just don't have it in themselves to join the table fellowship. So they have their own little table off to the side, and they're kind of looking, askance critically at Peter, because how could Peter be doing this? And again, Paul is telling this story. This is Galatians 2:11 through 14 or so. And then what happens is Peter feels this pressure. And this is not in the text, but what I imagine is Peter is sitting there and thinking like, what are they going to say about me when they're back in Jerusalem? And feels this pressure that many of us have felt in church kind of situations of when we were on the wrong side of a line. I remember one time as a college student, we went on this, this is a long time ago, back in the late 70s, and went on a field trip to and I won't name the church, or even, doesn't believe it all, what even state it was in. But this is a very big church. But I walked in, and this is the 70s, and I have my long hair and, nice colorful shirt. It was a Sunday evening service. I walk in, and everyone else there had, hair was above their ears. They were all wearing white. All the men were wearing white shirts and ties. And I immediately feel like, and you feel this shame, like, and it wasn't because leave me aside, get back to Peter. So that sort of feeling of like, people are looking at me, shame. So I think Peter's feeling that. He pulls back and leaves the table. And this is not just, let's have a snack after church or something. This is where they're having not just fellowship, but communion, the Lord's Supper. And then the other Jewish Christians leave from the table. So, and Paul says then he confronts Peter and says, Peter, what are you doing? You're not living according to the truth of the gospel. And then he says, in 2:16, hey, it's through the faithfulness of Jesus that we, even us Jews, this is how we're justified, brought into covenant relationship with God, the Gentiles as well. Okay, so why is Paul telling that story? So now if we go back to Luther for a moment. If the reason Paul is writing the letter to the Galatians is because there were individuals weighed down by guilt and confused about a teaching that's teaching you're saved by your works, why is Paul telling this story? Like it doesn't have anything to do with guilt, and it's not there's no mention of teaching. It's this question of who belongs at the table. What do you need to live like a Jew in order to be at this table fellowship? So Paul, I think, is telling this story because something very similar is going on in Galatia. And he is concerned that, again, there's going to be this ripping apart of the community. So what I think when Paul is writing the letter, he is writing out of concern for the community. Not to say there's not implications for individuals and their belief. And I think, Paul, I don't think Luther was wrong to come to the conclusions he did through reading the letter. Right. This has implications for individuals, but I don't think that was what was driving Paul to write it. And then one other observation, and I'll bring this long response to a close here, and then you can ask the question around, and then I'll go on to lenses. Is a really important thing is everyone in the letter to the Galatians is already a Christian. They're already Jesus followers. So this is not that Paul is writing to people who are not Christians and telling them the way to become a Christian is through grace, not through works. Everyone in here has already experienced God's grace, but they're sliding into this line drawing judgmentalism, I would say, over do you need to live like a Jew to truly be part of the family of God? So some outside missionaries, other missionaries have come in who are Jewish, and they're seeking to persuade the Gentile believers in Galatia, you need to be living like us Jews. And this sort of thing, like that, you or I or brothers experience to sort of like to truly be a Christian, to be a good Christian, you need to do things. So I think that is the issue that Paul is, confronting. Do you want to say anything about that? Should I go on to lenses?
Well, let's say a couple of things. One, if I think that happens a lot even today, of missionaries coming in and blurring the lines or drawing the lines of saying this is how you need to live, and there's going to be a lot of reteaching that needs to happen, some unlearning so that we could learn again. And oftentimes as missionaries, as we go out, we don't often think about what has to be unlearned before we start to learn again and move into a different direction of how this paradigm needs to shift and change. And so Paul's doing that. And two, I think even contrasting what Paul is saying in Galatians, it reminds me of 1 Corinthians, where Paul is really concerned about the rich eating all the food before the poor come, that there is division in the body, that he wants people at the table to be there together. It seems to be a critical import to Paul, not just here in Galatians, but in other letters that he has written, that this unity that we have, Jew and Gentile, slave and free, whoever it is, that we're together, it seems to be, this is one of the big things that Paul is really after, that we don't lose that, because that's how the world knows who Jesus is the way that we love one another, right?
Yeah. And I think that's especially true, Joshua, for those of us from the West who tend to read more through individualistic lenses, that we can turn Paul's community orientation into read it, it's about me, when, I think you're right, that he has this deep burden for the community, the health of the community, and what its witness is as a community.
Yeah. And, as you've been doing a lot of work with Centered Set Church, and what are centered sets, bounded sets, fuzzy sets, and if we take that lens and viewing of Galatians, we could start to look at what the community is doing here. So if you could want to speak a little bit to what those are, and if people want to hear more, they could go back to our earlier podcast episode where we go in deep, but give us a little general overview of what those things are, and then how that informs our reading of Galatians.
So this is something I'm borrowing from Paul Hebert, missiologist, and this is a very visual concept. So I will invite you to go to centeredsetchurch.com, and if you scroll down to the second pane there's a thing that says free PDF or something like that, and that has diagrams of what I'm going to explain right now. So hit pause, go get that, come back. So this is about how a community, how a group defines who belongs, discerns who belongs, might be a better way of saying it. And so one is a group that draws a line, and it has a certain set of characteristics, qualities, beliefs, draws a line, and then we have a circle, and whoever's within that who adheres to these things, complies, they're part of the group. And the group just looks, and you could feel this is what these people were doing who arrived from Jerusalem. Their line was, you don't eat with Gentiles. These Gentiles need to be circumcised and even live like Jews in order to be inside our line. We can eat with them. So that's called a bounded group, bounded set, borrowing from math. So a bounded set church is this line that's drawn, and whoever complies is within and the others without. And this has, especially in churches, I mean, there's bounded groups in society that, it's not like an evil thing to be bounded. There are things I tell my seminary students, you're a bounded group. You applied, you paid your tuition, you got, your GPA is high enough, you're in. But in churches, it tends to go in the direction of judgmentalism and this sense of we're in, we're better, and a lot of shaming that goes on as you get closer to the line or going over the line. Therefore, some people that they don't want this judgmentalism, and clearly the line is the problem. So they say get rid of the line, and you erase the line. And then what you have then is a fuzzy group, and it takes care of the judgmentalism problem, but it creates new problems. So a fuzzy group, its sense of identity dissipates because there's not something. It's not very clear who we are, why we are. Very hard to work for conversion in a fuzzy group because what are you calling the people to? And just ethically, discipleship, it's a low bar. It's about tolerance, not upsetting anyone. And that's, I heard someone recently say, you don't say to your wife or, your girlfriend, whatever, like, oh, I tolerate you. Like, that's not going to take you very far. So love is a much higher bar.
That's true. My wife would not like that.
No. So Hebert offers a third alternative. So bounded and fuzzy are on the same continuum. They're just different extremes. And so we go for, what's a different way of discerning whether someone belongs is rather than looking at their relationship with certain standard beliefs, look at their orientation towards a shared center. And so in a church, our center is Jesus. And what a centered set church does is it looks at, are you heading towards Jesus or heading away? And those who are heading toward belong. And so a great thing about a centered set is it can still take beliefs, behaviors, gives them importance and to a seriousness, like it matters.
Yeah.
But my security isn't in the line of where I'm at in relation to this line. My security is in the setter, and there's more room for process, for journeying, for pilgrimage, because we see someone who, they may be stumbling, not doing so well, but they're oriented towards the center. We're going to work with them. Just a quick example from Galatians, even when Paul, so Peter does it. He leaves the table. Paul is really upset with him. But what does Paul do? So I asked my students, if Paul was fuzzy set, what would he do? And some said, well, he wouldn't do anything, because he doesn't want to make Peter feel bad. Yeah. Or he might say, hey, Peter, I don't think that's too cool, but hey, you do your thing, I'll do mine. Let's try to get along. That'd be fuzzy. And bounded would have an argument about the line. It would say, oh, wait a minute, you guys, that is not what's important. This is what's important. And and so rather than saying, instead of circumcision, what really is important is, are we tithing or something? That's what determines at the table. But what does Paul say? He says, and it's directional language. He says to Peter, you are not walking, heading. It is orthopedo, something like that in Greek, where we get the orthopedic. So it's your feet are not heading in the direction of truth. You're the wrong way. Turn around, Peter. So he confronts him, right? So a centered set still takes things seriously, but he confronts them. And just one other little example of this, hint of this, in Galatians, there's two different times in Galatians where Paul says neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is the thing. And from a bounded group, that just shorts their circuit, because you're having this argument about, these other missionaries that come in and say, you Jews, you Gentiles have to get circumcised. And Paul is saying, no, you don't. You don't have to live like Jews. And so, but then when he says neither circumcision or uncircumcision, well, that's okay, well, what is it? And so he's pointing, no, we're about something else here than fighting over this line. So that's another, so I, with intentionality, sought to read Galatians through the lens of centered, bounded, fuzzy, and centered, with two aims. One is to understand those concepts better in a biblical sense, but also to see how that might help us. I might illuminate the reading of Galatians.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful to see what Paul is doing, and of we're moving in a certain direction. Are we moving towards Christ? Are we moving away from Christ? Are we in Christ? Are we out of Christ? He's the center. Jesus is the center. And so what does that look like then for us? If we're taking Galatians, what does it look like? Because, for us in the West, we read it through our own individualistic lenses, and we see it individually. But there is a sort of status that is happening in Galatia at the moment when or back in Antioch when Paul is telling the story of Peter coming in and the Jews coming in. They're sitting at separate tables. We have an elevated status. The Gentiles have a lower status. There seems to be this status type of mentality that is permeating through the culture. But we have it here in the West. We don't think about it, I don't think, as much. It doesn't permeate our thoughts, but I think we live it out. And that's what a bounded set is. Can you talk a little bit about what is the difference then between status keeping and keeping with the status quo and that bounded set, and then the difference between then having Jesus as the center, or our identity is something else? Is identity and status a little different?
Well, those are great questions. Let me reel myself in a little bit here. So the first to say, as you're talking, the other lens I sought to read Galatians through is honor and shame. And so, and again, in both of these, I think they point to there's greater riches in Galatians. So let me first say something briefly about identity in Galatians. And I think I'll read you a few sentences from the book. So this is in Galatians 3:9, and so I'll read this. This is from the NIV. It says, so those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham. And then the next verse is, and all who rely on observing the law are under a curse. And so that English translation of have faith, that it's understandable that people translate it well because it flows better in English. But more literally, and even like if you go New American Standard or King James, it's those who are of faith. And so again, that's not smooth English now. So it's understandable they do the other way. But if we go with that way, so when I was working on this, J. Lewis Martin especially, he put identity in here, and he said, so when you say those are of faith, that's identity language. And so he offers this, his translation paraphrase of it is those whose, for 9, it's those whose identity is in the faithfulness of Jesus, those who are of the faith, this is their identity. And in contrast, the others, those whose identity is derived from observance of the law. And so he's expanding a little bit, but it's basically those who are of circumcision, those who are of the faith of Jesus. So there is an identity sense is, where are you putting your identity? And so back to what you said, Joshua, the bounded group, and I think this is a really significant observation, is, lots of churches would say our center is Christ. Like that's common Christian language. But what happens in a bounded group, it's not that people don't believe Christ is their center. They're not going to say, oh no, Christ is not our center. But when you're secure, you naturally put your attention where your security lies. And in a bounded group, the line is where your security is. That's what tells me where I'm in. If you go back to that example, all those people in there with their white shirts and black ties, short hairs, that's their security. That's it telling them they belong. And so they put importance to that. Their identity is in their white shirt, black tie, or ties. And so Paul is saying, are you of the circumcision group? Is that your identity? Or are you of the Christ faithfulness? Is that where your identity? But into status, and this is where just in working through this anew, working on this book, I thought more about status, honor, and shame. And I read a dissertation by David Taylor, who worked at reading Galatians through an honor-shame lens. And and he's a much better Bible scholar than I am, and got into great depth on both honor-shame culture at that time, but also into some Greek issues in Galatians. And what there's this in Galatians 6. So there's this passage where Paul says, this is verse 12. Those who want to make a good impression outwardly are trying to compel you to be circumcised. The only reason they do this is to avoid being persecuted for the cross of Christ. And so what he said, reading that through an honor-shame lens. So I read persecution, I think of, martyrs or someone being put in prison. But he's saying, at that time, in an honor-shame sense, persecution is losing honor. And so he's saying these people, they are seeking to score religious points by getting you to live in the right way so that other Jewish people will be impressed with them. Jewish Christians will think, oh, good, you got these people to live like us. And other Jews who aren't followers of Jesus will not be as negative towards them because they're behaving better. It's not as scandalous. And Paul says, they don't really care about you. It's their honor that matters. That's what they're cared about. But then there's this fascinating thing. He goes, the next verse, not even those who are circumcised obey the law, yet they want you to be circumcised that they may boast about your flesh. So that, they're having this achievement. Then he says, verse 14, may I never boast except in the cross of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so, previously I thought that, that's kind of oxymoronic. May I never boast except in that, and think, Paul's just using that word because he just said it about them. But, boasting is wrong. Paul doesn't really want us to boast. But David Taylor, he points out, actually, in their context, so for us, boasting is wrong. Right. You shouldn't boast. But he said in their honor culture at the time, boasting was not an automatically bad thing. Boasting was a way that you're discerning what's honorable or not. So I say something, and so I gave the example in the book. I say it's like a little child comes up and says, or a couple of kids come up and say to the teacher, the parent, something. Oh, look what we did. And then how does the parent respond? So if the parent or the teacher responds positively, that lets everyone else in the room know, oh, this is a good thing to do. And so David Taylor says that's how boasting worked in their time. Someone would say, something I've done. And then if people respond positively, it informs this is appropriate behavior. So what is Paul saying? He's saying, I boast in the cross. Okay, now I'm on your status question. Okay, so status in Galatians, Paul says, I boast in the cross. But what did Jesus do with the cross? I mean, it's the total flipping upside down of the status system of the day. And so, whereas, here's this instrument of shame, and Jesus is willing to be shamed for our salvation. Jesus is willing to be shamed. And this is through his life, not just the cross, to include the excluded. So what is Paul boasting in? He's boasting in an honor system that derives its identity, derives its status, not by putting others down, but actually by lifting others up. And so it's this radical, so my status, so it's not a rejection of honor shame culture, but it's a redefinition of what's honorable. And my status is in the way of Jesus, which is this ironic thing that it's upside down to the way the world grabs status. So then you go back and read Galatians 3:28. in Christ, there's neither Greek nor Jew, slave or free, male or female. And it's because this status system has been undone. And I don't need to put someone else down. My status is in Jesus. Okay, that was a short sermon. I'll stop.
I like it. I heard the other day someone said that the exclusivity of Jesus is radically inclusive. That meaning that as we're moving towards Jesus, anybody can move towards Jesus. We're all invited to the table. It's your decision if you want to come to the table or not. But the table of Jesus is wide open. But he wants you at the table. And that's pretty scandalous for a lot of people that are living with judgmentalism or religiosity, this place where this is our people, this is how you get in, and if you want to look like us, you could be in. But Jesus says, no, anybody's invited to the table, but they have to be moving towards me. Yes. I'm the way. So as we move towards Jesus, we're at the table. Yes. So how does that inform the way that we start to live in the world? How do we create open tables that are not fuzzy, but they're towards Jesus, and they're radically inclusive, and we get rid of this judgmentalism, but we could be about Jesus himself.
Yeah. And so that's where I think that's where the fuzzy thing is really important to say, because the answer to your question would be, oh, well, just, get rid of the line and then then everyone's included. But that's not the way of Jesus. And so I think that's, very important to underscore here So when you ask the question, the first thing I thought of, the first thing we have to do is, erase the line. We have to attack the boundedness.
Yeah.
But fuzzy does that. But we don't just erase the line to say everyone in. We erase the line to say everyone is welcome. And I love your phrase. Jesus is radically inclusive, but not universally so. And this is where, again, I think Galatians as a whole, the letter is so helpful, because Paul both has this confrontation of line drawing religiosity and saying that is not the way, Peter. Stop. But then if you look at the last two chapters of Galatians, what's it talking about? First it's the work of the flesh, and it's all these things. Avoid all this, envious and backbiting and slander and drunkenness, and then fruit of the Spirit. And then Galatians 6:1, if someone sins, then come alongside of them gently and correct them, and carry each other's burdens. So I think, for us, it is this sense of radical welcoming, because the place at the table, Galatians would tell us 2:16, is because of what Jesus has done. It's not based on my achievement. So we're radically inclusive because we can say to anyone else, you are welcome to the table. This table is set by Jesus, not by what we've done. But then at that table, where's our identity? We are people of Jesus. And so Paul makes very clear, calls us to live in the way of Jesus. Because of having our identity in Jesus rather than the line, we can allow for, I wouldn't say more permeability, messiness on the edges. Like we can be more inviting of people without this tension of what's this say about me. But we're centered on Jesus, and that has implications. So it's not just, hey, anything goes.
That's helpful. Paul is talking a little bit. We get freedom from sin. We get freedom from something. So what is this freedom from? Like, what is Paul's thing that says, oh, this is what's bounding us up. This is what's inhibiting us from coming together and living out this radical way of grace. What is this freedom from? What's he saying?
Yeah. So, and this is clear. So Paul does not use the language of bounded group, right? That's something I'm saying. I think this can help us understand Paul. But, and this is where too, I think, Hebert has borrowed these concepts from math. They're concepts or ways of understanding, which I think are very helpful. But I think Paul even goes a layer deeper by, I think, getting into a sense of spiritual forces, principalities, and powers. And there's a really surprising couple sentences in chapter 4 of Galatians where Paul is talking. And so first in, where is this? In, 4:3, he says, when we were children, we were in slavery under the stoicheia. And so stoicheia is spiritual forces, basic principles, spiritual elemental forces, different ways of translating that. But he's saying we were under these things in slavery. And so here he's saying we Jewish people. But then a few verses later, talking now to the Gentile believers, he says in verse 8, formerly when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who are by nature not God. But now that you know God, or rather you know God, how is it that you're turning back to these stoicheia, the same thing, these spiritual forces? Okay, so just think about this for a moment. So Paul is saying, we Jews were enslaved to these spiritual forces. And now he's saying, and you Gentile Christian, used to be in this paganism and stuff. Why are you turning back to these enslaving forces? And I feel like I imagine them wanting them to, sort of raise their hand at that point and say, oh, wait a minute, Paul, we're not going back to paganism. We're in this Christian way. These other missionaries, they're Christians. They're just helping us. But Paul is equating, this surprising thing. He's equating this former way of Judaism that he was zealously about, their former paganism, and this new expression of Christianity that these other missionaries have brought that includes this sense of, living by Jews. And he puts them all as enslaving forces. Now, Paul is not there trashing the Old Testament or trashing the way of Jesus. But what I think what it gets at is there are this spiritual power of religion which grabs hold of good things, such as the law in the Old Testament or, our Christian faith today, and it turns it into an enslaving force. So I think to your question, what are we freed from? I think this chapter 4 points to we are liberated from this spiritual power that confuses. And this is where, Luther's certainly on the right track. It confuses what's the orientation, what's the work that's significant. Is it God's work liberating us or my work, our work to try to please God? That's religion. Is it me, bounded group drawing a line to get my security out of these things we've done, or is it putting my security in what God has done? So I think Paul liberates us not just from wrong information about salvation, gospel, grace, but also liberates us from this tendency to go the way of these spiritual powers that enslave. One last thing I'd say about that, which again, when what does it liberate us from? To the point I made, everyone in this letter has already, to use our language, has received Jesus as their Savior. They've already experienced grace. And what that says to me then is I need to keep hearing this liberating message of Galatians. I need to continue to be liberated from these spiritual forces, because my natural tendency is to go towards judgmentalism.
Mm-hmm.
When I was growing up, it was my list of, don't drink, smoke, dance, and that's what a way I used to judge other people that are good Christians. But today, I am most likely to become judgmental about someone else's judgmentalism. But it's still judgmentalism, right? Yeah. It's still me feeling superior, like, oh, look at those people, how bounded they are. And as soon as I say that, I've just drawn a line. Yeah. But through the work of Jesus, I can be free of that.
Well, I think this gets into something that I think we often miss, because I think in the West, we have a very scientific worldview where we see what is observable, and this is the way that things are. And if we change something up this way, things are going to shift and change, and we're going to be okay. If we just say we're going to move from drinking to not drinking, we'll be okay, or whatever it is, we're going to be fine because it's observable and we can see it. And we go to church, or other people go to other religious institutions for answers to, where did we come from? Who is God? Where are we going after we die? All these cosmic answers to questions. Often, I think in the West, we exclude these spiritual forces, this spiritual powers, this middle part that we often don't wrestle with, which a lot of the rest of the world wrestles with all the time. But in the West, we just ignore it. And we often think some of our problems are not spiritual in nature. We're not, moving through by different spiritual forces, or we're not being influenced by. We just have to change our behavior and we're going to be okay. Or we have to think on eternity more and we're going to be okay. So how do we get in the West a more robust view of the spiritual powers, to know that that's part of what's happening within our church bodies that we need to wrestle with?
You did a great job of explaining that briefly about that, that middle thing. And with humility, to say, for me, and I don't think I have a great full answer to that, but to one thing in relation to the topic we're talking about. As you can tell, I'm passionate about these concepts, this tool of bounded, fuzzy, and centered. But I think a way that I can get on the wrong path in relation to this, based on what you were just saying, is to start putting my confidence in the tool itself. Like if you have this diagram and you start thinking about orientation toward the center, then you're golden. Like, this is good. And whereas, I think Paul in Galatians calls me to recognize, it's not just this diagram that's going to save us and keep us on the right path, because there are spiritual forces that are seeking to take advantage of our tendencies in this direction, our longing for status and identity, and they will grab hold of things and use them. So I can't just teach bounded, fuzzy, and centered. I also need to teach, preach, and for myself, pray and live out that there really are powers that use these things, and I need to rest and rely on the victory through Jesus' death and resurrection that brings the ability to be able to, so if I'm, back in that situation of Peter there at Antioch, Peter could have thought about resurrection power and said, I am free. It doesn't matter what those people think. But instead he gave into the power, to the force. So I have that same thing, and yeah, I need that, the spiritual victory of Jesus, not just my handout sheet, the PDF that I just invited you all to look at.
The PDF is helpful, but we need to boast in the cross and in Jesus and lift others up, and I think that's helpful. So if we look at identity, we look at status, we looked at bounded and centered when it comes to Galatians. Is there any other things that we haven't touched on that you think that you want to draw out that is important for us as we look at Galatians?
Yeah, well, and you mentioned the community thing very well. So I won't highlight that. Let me, and I've said this implicitly. Let me say it explicitly. A benefit of reading Galatians through the lens of what's going on in Antioch versus the lens of Luther's experience is, and I did this, in ministry and, youth ministry as a missionary. How did I use Galatians? Because I was reading through the lens of Luther's experience. I thought, this is a letter for people who are confused about salvation by grace or salvation by works. And so when I encountered some of that situation, I said, let's read Galatians. But it was never for me. It was for them. They're the ones that are confused. So I'm doing a Bible study in Galatians for them, not for me. So I guess that another thing I would like to highlight is Galatians is a letter of import for all of us, not just them. So I read it now for me, for us, not just them. So that's one thing. The other thing is, and I first became excited about Galatians in a context of strong legalism in Honduras, but also a place where there was a lot of indifference to what I would call a holistic gospel. And so I was working in a very, very poor neighborhood. It was a squatter neighborhood, and there were 10 different churches in the neighborhood, and all of them were fairly indifferent or maybe even hostile to talking about Christian responsibility towards the poor and injustices. I mean, there would be some charity to people in their churches, but in the sense of, getting into the neighborhood and addressing poverty, and it just was not part of there. And so why is this going on? And what I came, and I won't give the whole thing here, but my thesis became, I think there was a sense of viewing, Amos or Isaiah 58 or even, Luke 4 of come to preach to the, the gospel for the poor and the blind and the liberate the captives, to see that, those are good things, but not central, because we got our gospel from Paul. And so I think another thing I would add to the list you said is, if we can appreciate that Paul's gospel is, yes, strongly concerned about an individual's relationship with Jesus, and also strongly concerned about the community, as you had already said, and then also how the community is living, and that then I think it enables us to read other things. It enables, the gospel to be bigger and broader in a holistic way in Paul, and not just in Luke 4 or Amos, Isaiah, things like that. So that'd be another thing I would add.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. And the holistic gospel is needed. What does it look like to see the kingdom of God come here on earth in wholeness? Good. I have a couple little questions for you at the end. So this one you may have to think a little bit about, but if you could have a dinner party with anybody, dead or alive, any 4 people, who would you have a dinner party with?
Wow. Yeah, well, right now, I mean, Paul comes immediately to mind just because we're talking about him so much. I don't know if I would always say that, but I'll say Paul right now. Will Campbell was a renegade Southern Baptist pastor he's a storyteller, and he had a very significant impact on my life. I'd love to have him at the table, and he would make it a lot more, quite interesting. Let's see. And I don't know, I'm watching The Chosen right now, like many other people, and it has me just, curious about, thinking more about Jesus' disciples. So I would take, not one particular, but just it'd be fun to have a disciple of Jesus at the table. And let me see. That's 3. I'll go with Jacques Ellul. He was a French sociologist, theologian, had a big impact on me as well. So, or was that 4 or 5?
That's perfect. That's great. That would be interesting. That would be a fun little dinner party right there. That would be great. Is there a thin place for you, a place where you feel the presence of God a little bit more innately? Where do you go when you want to be close?
Yeah, like I'm very nature wilderness oriented. So that would be sitting along a stream where I can hear rapids or something like that would be my thin place in the individual sense. Although I would say, I've had such deep experiences in Honduras where I was a missionary that dropped me down into a little church somewhere in Honduras singing praise songs, and I'm quickly in tears. So,
beautiful. How can people connect with you in your book and anything else you want to say?
So let me. So the thing I already mentioned, centeredsetchurch.com has information about this book and my other book on Centered Set Church, and also some videos, and my email address is at the bottom of the first page of that. And I guess one other thing I'd like to say about this book was this is written. It's part of a series, commentary series that is designed for use by groups. So this is written for lay people, not a lot of scholarly footnotes and things like that, discussion questions at the end. So just to, put that on the genre of the book.
Perfect. Yeah, it'll be great for any groups to come and get this book, Freedom from Religiosity and Judgmentalism. And so looking at Mark's study of Galatians. And so, Mark, thank you for this conversation. It was great. It was fascinating to really look at Galatians in a new way, new lens through bounded and centered sets, fuzzy sets, to look at it through the lens of honor, shame, status and identity, look at it through what Paul is really after as we're coming together as the body of Christ, that it's written to a group of believers and not just pre-believers that are wanting to enter into the relationship with Jesus. So thank you for contrasting what we typically think of what it looks like as Luther's view of Galatians, and just reading it for what it is. So thank you for this conversation. It was really good. I loved it.
Thank you very much. It was great to be with you again.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review, and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.